Hello to my friends and family and my audience. This is Sunny Sharma, India Insight with Sunny Sharma. Today I will be doing a new podcast on my next section for Let Nobody Turn Us Around. It will be on the foundations of slavery and abolitionism in 1768 to 1861. And before I delve into some of the Black intellectuals, abolitionists, historians, etc., who were significant in perpetuating and proliferating Black ideas, especially some of the foundational ideas of Black nationalism that future icons would carry through during the Civil Rights era and before. I want to really look at the significance of Abraham Lincoln just to share, this is my point of view. This is my point of view of Abraham Lincoln. You may have a different perspective about him. But I, for one, think he was probably one of the most significant figures of the 19th century, along with Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells. And he was significant because he was one of the major proponents of political democracy, which was what the projected goal of the abolitionist period was, to really bring Black people into the political fold of American democracy. And as I said before in past podcasts, there were projects of democracy in different eras of American history. In the 1930s and 40s, there was a push for social democracy, as seen through the expansion of the social safety net by President FDR. And there was a push for participatory democracy in the 1950s and 1975 with the New Left movement. So before those, I'll talk about more in future podcasts when those eras come up. But now, first, I want to look at the significance of Abraham Lincoln in about 4 pages. So, President Lincoln presided over the American government in one of its most trying periods, the Civil War. He emancipated the slaves through an understanding that what is more important than the enacting of laws and proclamations is the ability to mold public opinion and respond to public sentiment. He had an uncanny ability and perception of the understanding the minds of his cabinet, the public, press, and his enemies, which allowed him to navigate complex political problems, including fulfilling the fundamental abolition of slavery in America once and for all, something which the founding fathers of America believed could only be accomplished by legislative authority. With due gratitude to Lincoln, there was not just a triumph of the project of representative self-government when the Civil War was won by the Northern Union states in 1865. There was also a cognitive shift in how Americans viewed nationhood. For the first time, America was not merely a federation of various states. It was a contiguous, united mass whereby Americans shared a common identity, whether one lived in the North or South. I would like to share some fundamental insights and lessons from President Lincoln's legacy. President Lincoln is not just synonymous with the abolitionist aspirations of the newly formed Republican Party, he also evolved to be an ardent advocate for the preservation of American democracy against many of the forces and tensions that the founding fathers warned could pull the Union apart. As a leading figure against the expansion of slavery to Western states, he was strongly abhorred by all the Southern slave states, and consequently, his election led to the secession of the South and the beginning of the Civil War in 1860. He warned Americans of not just the moral degradation of slavery, but also the dangers of sectarian factionalism, as seen through some of his early speeches against the problems of tyranny of the majority, rising and threatening minority groups. This sentiment was expressed in one of his most famous speeches called A House Divided. However, President Lincoln understood that he was walking on a fine line when it came to the issue of slavery, especially regarding how he communicated his stance to Southern Democrats, which shifted from being anti-slavery, merely being against the expansion of slavery, to being an abolitionist, demanding the eradication of the institution of slavery. President Lincoln was one of a handful of presidents who came from the lower commoner class. Most historians agree that his upbringing most likely made him at odds against any unjust capitalist and bond exploitation against any human being. More importantly, reflecting 18th century Enlightenment principles, President Lincoln consistently expressed that slavery was against natural rights and biblical principles, shown through his proclamation in his 1854 Peoria speech that, if the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one's making a slave of another. Nonetheless, President Lincoln was very careful about how he relayed his stance against slavery to the Southern states until the circumstances of the Civil War made it a military necessity to free 3.5 million slaves in the South. As the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin expresses in her seminal book, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of President Lincoln was the humanitarian as broad as the world. Although President Lincoln made many speeches, he was a man of action who always relied on first principles, whether it was allusions to past American history, constitutional themes, or the Bible. In his 1860 Copper Union speech, he insists that because most of the signers of the Constitution, 21 out of 39, voted against the expansion of slavery to new territories, we should follow the same consensus and sentiment. More importantly, at the dawn of the Civil War, President Lincoln alluded to not just to the historical significance of the struggle and risk that the founding fathers faced as seen through the Declaration of Independence and how it related to his task of uniting the country during the Civil War, he also spoke to the responsibility that America had to the world in demonstrating the value of democratic self-government. This was extraordinary considering it precluded the era of American involvement on the global stage decades later. President Lincoln was not just a trendsetter foreshadowing wider American involvement in the world, discussing mob violence as seen through many of the tensions with minority rights, especially in the segregated South, and reflecting the aspirations of democratic self-government for hundreds of burgeoning democratic countries across the world. He also related in his 1861 first inaugural address the need to remember, in spite of drastic violence, that Americans must remain friends. President Lincoln, in his most famous speech, the 1863 Gettysburg Address, speaks to the full measure of devotion that the soldiers of the Northern Union sacrificed for the cause of freedom. What many people don't understand is that much of this mystical devotion was also given to President Lincoln, a leader who endeared his image to his fellow citizens, soldiers, and millions of slaves to garner enough support to win the Civil War. It is worth quoting the end of this speech by President Lincoln, though it is worth reading all of this very short speech, whereby President Lincoln declared for all Americans his resolve to preserve the sacred democratic tradition of American, so that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Throughout President Lincoln's speeches are both allusions to our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, as well as allusions to the Old and New Testament. In another one of the greatest speeches in American history, his 1865 second inaugural address, given at the end of the war, President Lincoln speaks of the blood spill to pay for the consequences of the war and sin of slavery. In alluding to the Old Testament, President Lincoln was speaking to a deeper truth that all people aspire towards freedom, and we, as the children of our ancestors, are paying for their faults, particularly the bondage of one person over another. More than anything, President Lincoln spoke of the need, emblematic in biblical literature, to care not only for those less fortunate, but also to help those who are victims of the brutality of war, such as the orphan and the widow. Lastly, President Lincoln sought a just peace, not just internally, by which he encouraged forgiveness and liberality after the war, even for political dissenters and citizens of the rebel Southern Confederacy, but he also wanted peace among all the nations of the world. Consequently, he was not just perceived as one of the first true American leaders in a contiguous continent, he also alluded to America's involvement on a global stage in the future. There is so much to say about President Abraham Lincoln, and it probably warrants its own podcast or several podcasts of its own. But one thing is for certain: had he lived on to see the founding of the three Reconstruction Amendments, especially the 14th Amendment that gave equal protection by the law to all American citizens, he may have been able to ensure the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule to each slave, allow blacks to elect their own representatives, and hopefully would have been able to maintain protections for black citizens in the South. Did President Lincoln's sequestration of war powers and halt of habeas corpus defy constitutional principles and provisions while setting a dangerous precedent for executive overreach? Perhaps, but his ability to understand public opinion and communicate the reasons and necessity for playing with constitutional parameters to the wider American public allowed him to get the public on his side, rally the troops, and win the war. Nonetheless, President Lincoln stood the test of times, navigating complex political dilemmas, including leading his diverse cabinet, leading the Northern Union to victory, cementing his legacy as a proponent of the emancipation of 3.5 million slaves, as being synonymous with the America's project and self-government for all leaders and nations to live up to. So I'll also preview the figures who I'll be talking about in this podcast on slavery and abolitionism, beginning from 1861 and onward. So I'll be mentioning casually FDR, the first Black author Phyllis Wheatley, David Walker, who was also an abolitionist, the slave resistor Nat Turner, Murray W. Stewart, the Amistad Revolt, which involved three past presidents, eighth President Martin Van Buren, who was for giving the slaves back to the Spanish, the sixth President John Quincy Adams, who freed the slaves, second President John Adams, who really was reflecting the legacy of his son John Quincy Adams, the figure Henry Highland Garnet, and Malcolm X, who really carried forth many of the theoretical ideas of black nationalism of past black figures, and of course Sojourner Truth, who was a very prominent abolitionist leader, and of course the most prominent abolitionist of the abolitionist period, Frederick Douglass. Martin R. Delaney, who was also an abolitionist, as well as one of the first black leaders during the black army leaders during the Civil War. And I'll casually mention Reverend James Lawson, who, like Frederick Douglass, wanted the Constitution to come alive, and John S. Rock, who coined the term Black is Beautiful, and Martin R. Delaney, as I mentioned before, coined the term Africa for Africans and was one of the first proponents of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. Now to go into detail in this section, slavery and abolitionism, 1768 to 1861. If you enjoyed this video podcast, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. Now for Let Nobody Turn Us Around is slavery and abolitionism. Many historians define three critical periods in American history that advance three different aspects of American democracy. During the mid-19th century, there was a push for political equality, primarily reflected through the abolitionist movement. During the 1930s and 40s, there was an advancement of social democracy, as seen through the New Deal policies implemented by President FDR to recover America from the Great Depression. And finally, in the New Left movement from the 1950s to 1975, there is a push for participatory democracy, as evidenced by Black people's push for the central right to vote for their representatives and to gain all the privileges in society that voting entailed, such as the right to sit on a jury and judge their peers. The authors of Let Nobody Turn Us Around and African American Anthology draw the same conclusion, declaring that the long-term goal of Black reform was the redefinition of American democracy itself, the elimination of all restrictions to the full participation of African Americans in the larger society. This story, however, is not just more complicated, it also begins much further back, all the way to Phyllis Wheatley, an African-American slave who was born in 1753 in Gambia, West Africa, who is recognized as the first African-American to publish a book in America. Her poetry reflects a long tradition of the creative and intellectual legacy of African-Americans in the West. But however, there are some Blacks who are free, such as David Walker. Born in 1785 in Wilmington, Ohio, David Walker became a well-known spokesperson against slavery, even recommending violence if necessary to achieve freedom, while also contributing to the first African-American newspaper, Freedom's Journal. In his famous appeal, he elucidates the fall of Carthage by the Romans with the Black experience in America, where he explains that Carthage, but they were disunited as the colored people are now in the United States of America. The reason our natural enemies are unable to keep their feet on our throats. Walker insists it is not the skill of politicians that has led to the preservation of the government, but in fact it is the religious morality that has preserved democracy, whereby tyrants may think they are so skillful in state affairs is the reason that the government is preserved. But I tell you that this country would have given up long ago, was it not for the lovers of the Lord. The history of resistance to slave bondage is more prevalent than most people realize. The most famous slave revolt in America was led by Nat Turner, who was born in 1800, and this revolt was outlined in his 1831 statement. The author relates Turner's actions symbolized the successive generations of African Americans, a fierce determination to achieve freedom. Turner was not just restless, inquisitive, and observant of everything, as seen through his grasp of language at an early age. He was also divinely inspired. Turner could not have led so many if it wasn't for his education. There is a fundamental reason that slaves were prohibited from reading and writing by law, and this only became more stringent after his revolt. The author so eloquently describes that slave masters understood that their social control of slaves could not be based solely on physical coercion. Knowledge was power, and virtually all slave codes established in the United States set restrictions, making it illegal to teach slaves to read or write. As related before, in spite of much of the restrictive norms of society, many women contributed substantially to advancing minority rights. Maria W. Stewart, an orphan with no formal education, born in 1803, in her essay "What If I Am a Woman," highlights the inequality of the slave system in a religiously inspired manner as we have pursued the shadow, they have obtained the substance. We have performed the labor, they have received the profits. We have planted the vines, they have eaten the fruits of them. Stewart was keenly aware that the white masters were severely underestimating the value of their slave laborers. The Amistad Revolt is another example of slave resistance that was depicted in a Hollywood movie by Steven Spielberg in 1997. The author writes that in 1839, a group of Africans who had been captured by slave traders and were being transported to a Cuban port seized control of the ship. The ship, called Amistad, landed in the United States. President Martin Van Buren urged that the Africans be turned over to the Spanish authorities. However, former sixth president John Quincy Adams represented the Africans before the Supreme Court. After reviewing the evidence and declaring that they had been illegally kidnapped, the Africans were set free. Just as his father, President John Adams, had to rely upon the law regardless of popular opinion, in his case defending British soldiers before the American Revolution, President John Quincy Adams had to strip off the disguise and look at the case according to his naked realities. It is also clear that the abolitionist movement had a strong religious bent, as seen through such men as Henry Highland Garnet, an educated minister born in 1815, who became an advisor to President Abraham Lincoln. At the 1843 National Negro Convention, he delivered a controversial speech advocating the violent overthrow of the system of slavery, echoing a century before a similar sentiment shared by Malcolm X. Yet even today, there are some historical women even more well known than some of the men, including the orator Sojourner Truth. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Black feminist scholar Dr. Bell Hooks declared that although Sojourner Truth, who was born in 1799, was living in a male-dominated society, she became a prominent model of Black feminist activism and courage as reflected through her abolitionist preaching across the country. She worked closely with many of the leading abolitionists, especially Frederick Douglass, becoming involved in the early women's rights movement. She was one of a handful of Black women in the 19th century who set the foundation for Black feminism while also contributing to the wider project of the emancipation of the human race. Another contemporary with the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who many people know little about, was Martin Delany, born in 1812. In 1843, he produced one of the earliest African American newspapers, The Mystery, while also working closely with Douglass on the North Star newspaper. Diverting from many of Douglass's perspectives, he wrote a seminal book called The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, Politically Considered, which presented a program of racial separatism and advocated colonization to achieve Black liberation. Moreover, he became a major in the 104th U.S. Colored Troop, ran unsuccessfully for Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina, and was involved in numerous other efforts, including contributing to Black excellence as an educator, physician, explorer, author, and journalist. He set the precedent for Black nationalism all across the world in response to white economic inequality, political colonialism, and social oppression. He insisted that African Americans seize their own agency in shaping their circumstances, shown by his provocation that what we desire to learn now is how to effect a remedy. This we have endeavored to point out. Our elevation must be the results of self-efforts and work of our own hands. No other human power can accomplish it. If we but determine it shall be so, it will be so. Let each one make his case own and endeavor to rival his neighbor in honorable competition. In this proclamation, he speaks to the value of industry and individualism that are all too American, but also indicates the fundamental hypocrisy of the northern free states, which he describes as providing many of the same lower-class occupations as the South, demonstrated by his description by which, being their maids, servants, cooks, waiters, and menials in general, there, as we have here, that had they known for a moment before leaving that such was to be the only position they occupied here, they would have remained where they were and never left. That is a big statement. Frederick Douglass, born in 1818, was the most prominent and influential African American leader of the 19th century, as well as one of the greatest American orators in history. He established the North Star paper, worked as a member of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, was involved in many reform movements, including women's suffrage, and after the Civil War, became a central figure in the National Republican Party. In one of his most famous speeches, the 1852 What to a Slave is the 4th of July, he speaks to the hypocrisy of American celebration and praise that gave freedom to white landowning men, but ignored the plight of slaves who, through their labor, built a nation. An example of Douglas's wonderful oratory and descriptive ability is seen through his approbation in response towards the Dred Scott decision, where he declared, "Your fathers have said that man's right to liberty is self-evident. There is no need of argument to make it clear. The voices of nature, of conscience, of reason, and of revelation proclaim it as the right of all rights, the foundation of all trust, and of all responsibility. Man was born with it. It was his before he comprehended it." Douglas also foreshadows the impending Civil War, where he declares the proponents of slavery would seek the destruction of the Union because slavery lives and flourishes best in the absence of civilization. He also speaks to the spirit of the Constitution standing in direct opposition to the institution of slavery, whereby, thus, the very essence of the whole slave code is an open violation of a fundamental provision of the Constitution, and is an open and flagrant violation of all the objects set forth in the Constitution. Douglas also takes the position that although the church and the founding fathers of the American Republic stand in direct opposition to Judge Taney's decision on the Dred Scott case, he predicts that ultimately the abolition of the institution of slavery would have to come through the fruition of the legislative authority. Frederick Douglass's final message to the American people, like Reverend James Lawson, who died last year, is to make the Constitution to come alive. In conclusion, let me say all I ask of the American people is that they live up to the Constitution, adopt its principles, imbibe its spirit, and enforce its provision. Echoing the Black nationalism of Martin R. Delaney by advocating Black power and Black pride is John S. Rock, born in 1825. His words and advocacy would become a part of the Black Power movement nearly a century later, as seen through his analysis of racism, shown through his speech as the first Black man to plead before the Supreme Court. Like Delaney's allusion to individualism as a vehicle to liberation, Rock shares a similar sentiment through his statement that, "My friends, we can never become elevated until we are true to ourselves." Through talent, skills, and industry, he sought to make Black people powerful and wealthy enough to warrant not just self-respect, but also an acknowledgement of their merit and position in life as equals in society. Most importantly, overlaying and underlying the fight for liberation, whether it was through abolition, education, or advocacy, was an intense sentiment of spirituality. The author describes this sentiment in his concluding essay on slavery and abolitionism, 1768 to 1861, whereby the themes of suffering, struggle, faith, and transcendence are all pivotal in the development of the African American spirituals. In our current society that is slowly losing its spiritual connection, the words of these Black men and women resound loudly. It was the efforts of not just intellectually gifted people, but also spiritually inspired agents that gave rise to the efforts to advance political equality for all people, as demonstrated by the efforts to abolish slavery in the 19th century. The moral leadership of the church did not just provide community to Black people, it also gave a sense of purpose and meaning to the advancement of social justice, as seen through the abolitionist movement. Even if some Blacks lost hope in a church whose values were sometimes misrepresented, many Blacks drew great strength from biblical tales in which they applied the story of the Israelites to their own condition. Moreover, if the Promised Land was far off, many Blacks viewed that the aspirations of America's founding document, the Constitution, had to come alive if the historically marginalized were to finally achieve justice, liberty, and most of all, reach closer to the 19th century projected goal, political equality. Nonetheless, what we would see in the next periods of American history was not just a backlash against Black liberation, but fortunately an expansion of democratic values for not just Blacks, but a whole host of other people. If you enjoyed this video podcast, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. My podcast is called India Insight with Sunny Sharma, and my YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma. These 6 episodes are in honor of Black History Month in February. In the description below are titles for the upcoming 5 new episodes based off of the 5 sections reflecting the 5 periods of American history since 1768 up till 2008, with the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. These sections are based off of the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American Anthology. My next podcast episode will be on Section 2, Reconstruction and Reaction, the Aftermath of Slavery and the Dawn of Segregation, 1861 to 1915. Now a little bit for a preview of some of the figures who I'll be talking about in the next podcast on Reconstruction and the Dawn of Segregation. So Frederick Douglass will be mentioned again. He will be responding to the currents of Black thought during that period. There will also be Henry McNeill, a mention of the Black urban worker as Blacks start to enter the space of occupation and start to form unions, and are also banned from unions that are formed by other whites, and we will see the tensions involved in that struggle. There'll also be Thomas Fortune, Alexander Crummell, and Julia Cooper. There'll be many other women such as Mary Church Terrell, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Paul Laurence Dunbar. The most prominent Black figure of the early 20th century, Booker T. Washington, William Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who's the most important African American journalist in history. Perhaps it's the opinion of the author, the most important Black intellectual of American history. W.E.B. Du Bois, and Hubert Henry Harrison. And in general, who are these people? They are educators, scholars, historians, clergy, intellectuals, African American sociology founders, who is W.E.B. Du Bois, journalists such as Ida B. Wells, and whistleblowers such as Ida B. Wells. They are all dissenters. Many of them are abolitionists, and many of them are civil rights icons who lived to see not just the end of slavery and the end of Reconstruction, but lived to see the beginning of the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, many of these figures did not live to see the civil rights movement and all the consequences of the civil rights movement, particularly the passing of the civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, which also included other such provisions which advance the cause of the Black struggle. Many did not live to see this, but it is in thanks to these Black figures as well as the ones in the past that there was the civil rights legislation and that there was an advancement of the Black liberation struggle. So I thank you for listening, and I hope you can join me for future episodes on Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology. Okay, thank you.